17 participants are there. We'll wait for 2 more minutes.
Okay. Okay.
We'll get some more participants. And the last session was very nice. The feedback from the participants is very, very nice regarding the collaboration.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I am happy.
Yes, it was really purposeful.
I hope something. I have received for 3 months stay in our lab.
Yes.
From a senior
scientist. Okay. So the other thing is I'm scheduling a valedictory program after the lectures on 25th. So maybe some invitees from your end, if it is there, so I will add them in the invitation, just like the inauguration. So
yes.
And after the session and valedictory, there will be an examination for the participants.
Yes, I'm preparing a multiple choice test.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So it will be
I'll send you.
Yes. It is in the Google Classroom platform, so that evaluation will be automatic.
Oh yeah. Okay.
You can take the grade sheets directly from the classroom.
Okay.
Okay. So then let us start, sir. So let them join one by one gradually. I will put a reminder message to all the participants.
Okay.
Yes.
So today, Today I will start with genetic and environmental risk factors for breast cancer and a little presentation of genomics of breast cancer, what we have learned from breast cancer genomics. So breast cancer is a worldwide disease. We have 1.38 million new breast cancers a year worldwide, 50% of these breast cancers and 60% of deaths occur in lower income countries. So breast cancer is not only a disease of affluent countries. 80% 5-year survival is observed in high income countries, and unfortunately only 40% 5-year survival in low income countries. In the United States, there is an estimated number of cases of over 200,000 a year, with almost 40,000 deaths associated. And the lifetime risk in the United States is 12.38%. That means that a woman has 1 woman out of 8 will develop breast cancer at some point of her life. So it's a real highly incident disease. The risk factors that we know are very manifold. Obviously, age is a risk factor like it is for all cancers. As I said, the lifetime risk is 1 in 8, and it is increasing by age. So in younger women, the risk is relatively low. It's only 1 in 202, and it goes up to the older women with a 1 in 28 in the class of 6 to 69 years, and even more so in the elder. The personal history of breast cancer obviously is associated with the breast cancer risk. So if you had ductal carcinoma in situ before, or even worse, if you already had breast cancer and invasive carcinoma, or especially if you had an estrogen receptor negative cancer, or if you develop cancer at a very young age, then you are at high risk to develop a second cancer. But also benign breast pathology is associated with the breast cancer risk. If you have proliferative breast lesions or an atypical hyperplasia, then you have a higher risk of breast cancer. It also depends on family history. When you consider first-grade relatives, and there is also a correlation with the number of first-grade relatives who had breast cancer and the age at diagnosis of these relatives. And that is obviously linked to the genetic predisposition. 20 to 25% of breast cancer patients have a positive breast cancer family history, but only 5 to 10% have a clear autosomal dominant inheritance. And we will come to that later. So that would be the genetic predisposition. The endogenous hormones, essentially the lifelong exposure to estrogens is a risk factor. So that means if you start with menarche early on, or if you go lately in menopause, your risk increases. And the testosterone levels are inversely related to the breast cancer risk. So it's as many estrogens as you produce over your whole life are related to the breast cancer risk. And that's also related to the reproductive history, because parity and breastfeeding are associated with breast cancer. So because during parity and during breastfeeding, you do not produce estrogens, and they lower the risk, unless if the first full-term pregnancy is at early age. And you have environmental exposure to radiation that can be childhood cancer treatment or other cancer treatment, nuclear power, and hormone replacement therapy. And lifestyle, alcohol consumption, physical activity, obesity. And it may also be the type of diet you follow. But that are the really confirmed breast cancer risk factors. And I have given different colors to these types of risk factors because the red ones are the genetic, you cannot do anything about it. And these one also are cannot be influenced, but lifestyle, environmental, and eventually reproductive history can be influenced. So let us talk a little bit about the genetic risk. In 1990, the breast cancer gene 1 was isolated. It was described for the first time in 1990 and isolated in 1994. And soon after, the second breast cancer gene was isolated. And the question arose, where is breast cancer gene 3? And as you see, almost 30 years have passed and we don't have breast cancer gene 3. So we can, this is a relatively old slide, but not so much has changed in the meantime. So most of the cancers are sporadic, only a tiny part, about 10%, have a clear familial hereditary. And BRCA1 and BRCA2 take together 40% of these cases, and other genes take relatively few, and there is a large part of these genetically determined cancers where we do not know the gene that is causing the disease, and it is very likely that there is a polygenic determination of the breast cancer risk. So that it's not just a single gene, but it's a whole group of genes, and that makes it very difficult to identify them. So essentially, there is no other gene like BRCA1 or BRCA2 that accounts for a large part of the breast cancer hereditary risk. So BRCA1 and BRCA2 are what we call high penetrance genes. So that means that the cumulative risk, if you are carrier of a breast cancer 1 mutation for breast cancer, is 57% by 70 years. If you would look at 80 or 90 years, you would come almost to the even higher percentages. And this means if you carry a breast cancer 1 mutation, then you have a very high risk to develop breast cancer, but you do not know when. And similarly for ovarian cancer. And these numbers are a little bit lower for BRCA2, especially for ovarian cancer. But still, the 2 genes are high penetrance genes. If you have the mutation, you have an elevated risk to develop breast cancer at some point of your life. And that's why how we distinguish genetic risk in cancer. You have high penetrance, but low incidence genes. So that means you have high penetrance, as I said. So if you have the mutation, you are likely to get the cancer, but very few people have these mutations. And normally in the past, these genes were identified by linkage disequilibrium studies, analyzing co-segregation in breast cancer families. So you have many families, and you simply look at which part of the chromosome is inherited by all the people who have got breast cancer. And we can be sure that there are not other genes like BRCA1 and BRCA2, because today we do not do any more linkage disequilibrium in families, but we simply sequence the exomes. So we would have found it in the meantime, because that's much easier than linkage disequilibrium studies. And it's much more reliable, because either you see the mutation or you don't see it. So we can almost exclude that we have other really high penetrance, low incidence genes. So at the beginning, in the first decade of this century, people started to do trio sequencing. So you sequence mother, father, and the patient, because the hypothesis was that they have simply new mutations, so that either one of the parents carry a rare mutation, or in the passage of the genetic material from one generation to the other, there occurs a new mutation, since we know that there do occur mutations, and that these mutations can then determine breast cancer. So we're looking for high penetrance genes, but that were really extremely low incidence. So they run in families. They are so-called private mutations. Essentially, some were found, but that was not really successful. So it's not so frequent as initially estimated. So the only remaining possibility is that we have low penetrance, high incidence genes. That means variants of genes that are very diffuse in the population, but that confer a low risk of developing breast cancer. And essentially, the single nucleotide variants that we were looking for could act in concert. So you could have many such genes that have variants that are in some way linked to breast cancer. And according to the number of these variants that you inherit, your risk is defined. These genes are found by genome-wide association studies, where you analyze sporadic cases and controls. So you do not analyze families. One word on genome-wide association studies. Genome-wide association studies are normally performed by microarrays for single nucleotide variants, or they can also be performed by sequencing. Whatsoever you have hundreds of thousands of single nucleotide variants, and you simply look for each variant, you have 2 alleles, or in some instance you might have 3 alleles, but normally these nucleotide variants are present in the population in 2 variants. So you have one nucleotide or the other, essentially, at a certain position, and you simply look in the patients versus the controls at the frequency of the 2 alleles. And then you make a statistic test to attribute a p-value to the frequency in the patient group. And then simply you cut a threshold line and say, this is my threshold. The SNVs that are above the threshold, that have a higher probability to be actually linked to the risk, I will then consider in a validation study. Or you select some that for some reason have a biological reason to have an effect of the phenotype you are analyzing. And this here I show you a genome-wide association study for body height, because it's very easy to understand. So we know that body height is in some way genetically determined. So it runs in families. No? Very large parents often get very high children, and very small ones tend to have more smaller children. It also depends on diet, but there is a clear genetic contribution. And so this study, published already in 2008, actually identified 30 or more than 30 single nucleotide variants that are associated to body height. And adding these to a continuous model where you say the more SNVs you have at the high side, the higher you are. That was perfectly linear. So there's a linear association between the number of height-related single nucleotide variants you carry and your body stature. But the problem is that it just explains 6 centimeters. No, it goes from -3 to +3, approximate height difference in centimeters. And we know that height is variable in the population by much more than 6 centimeters. So normally what happens in genome-wide association studies is that anyway, we discover only a minor part of genetic variability. And that's what we can expect also for breast cancer. This is an example how it is carried out. Here you just have a region of the genome. And I think that here the important gene is PDZK1, which is important in breast cancer. And you see the actually genotyped SNVs are the black ones. But since we know the architecture of human chromosomes, and we know the linkage between variants, we can impute other variants. We can impute the value for other variants. That's a mathematical procedure based on the SNVs genotyped to calculate how the others should behave, to estimate the others. So you get at the end a very dense, among genotyped and imputed variants, you get a very dense a distribution of variants over certain regions associated with the p-value. And then you can see that in this region, you get a distribution like that. And you can estimate that here something must be. In this case, it's PDJ-K1, which is associated with proliferation in breast cancer. And then you obviously have still to go down to look, to validate this in independent cohorts. And then you have to understand, what does the single nucleotide variant actually do? And you don't know which one it is, because you measure only an association, not a causal relationship. The causal relationship must be found by molecular studies later on. And this has been done for many, many breast cancers. And what comes out is you get many nucleotide variants that are associated with breast cancer in a very highly significant manner. That are p-values of 10 to the -9. But the effect is weak. 0.95 means that people who carry this nucleotide variant have a 5% reduction in risk as compared to the whole population. And this one has a 7% increased risk, 15%, 8% reduced, 5% reduced, 5% increased, 7% reduced, 5%, and so on. So it's very weak effect, which might, however, become important if these variants are combined. So if you can say a person that carries this and this variant, whether this can be added, then you would be at 23%, 22%. And that's already important. So these variants are also associated with specific subtypes of breast cancer. For example, we have variants that are associated with estrogen receptor positive breast cancer. And that's important because we know that essentially estrogen receptor positive and estrogen receptor negative cancers are two different diseases. So we would expect that there are different nucleotide variants associated with one or the other. And that's what we observe. And you can also have variants that are associated with BRCA1 and BRCA2 carriers. That means these carriers of mutations in these two genes already have an elevated risk, but if they have in addition some of these variants, they have an even higher risk and maybe an earlier development of the disease, because it makes a big difference if you are a BRCA1 carrier, whether you will develop breast cancer at 30 or at 80. It makes a big difference. And if you look at the single gene, I take here MAP3 kinase 1, it can be associated, or it is associated with ER positive and ER negative cancer, but much more with ER positive cancer. And it's also associated with BRCA2, but apparently not with BRCA1. So that's due to the biology of this specific gene. And there is some work that I'm not going to show, and we have contributed to it, that shows that the MAP3K1 polymorphism is especially associated with a mutation in PI3K. not a germline mutation, but a somatic mutation. So if your cancer has a PI3K mutation, then you will easily find this nucleotide variant of MAP3K1. So there's much to do to understand the biology behind these associations, because it are just associations. So what can we do with these nucleotide variants? How can that be translated into the clinics? What we know about the variants is they are highly significant. At present, they are well validated in several independent studies, so we can be relatively sure about them, and they are subtype specific. However, each single variant has only a very weak effect. In order to use breast cancer risk SNVs in clinical decision-making, single SNVs must be combined in multigenic risk models. And obviously, clinical decisions must consider always the genetic and other risk factors. So that's a relatively old slide from 2008, where the group of Pfeffer and colleagues started to do multigenic risk modeling. And they just took the 7 most important single nucleotide variants that were known at that time. And as I told you, they have a relatively high frequency, so they are very prominent in the population, but the risk associated is relatively low. So it's 26%, 20%, 13%, and so on. And they explain only a small part of the total variance and risk. That's the risk distribution in the population, which is also obviously a Gaussian distribution that goes from 40% according to the mean of the population up to 250%, which also says nobody is at no risk, because that doesn't exist. No, there is nobody who can be completely at no risk of cancer. And that's the mean, and it much depends on what you consider, what you want to do, whether you want to identify the risk that is just over the mean risk, or whether you want to identify the really high risk. And you could also distinguish groups in between here, where you could say the real high risk, I have really to do something in the clinics. Whereas at the real low risk, I can, for example, recommend you don't need mammography. You have no very high risk. So, and that's an estimation. At that time, it was an estimation what can be done with 7 SNVs. So if you look at the 20% of the highest risk with 7 SNVs, you can explain 30% of the cases. If you would look at the 50%, so all those that are just above the mean risk, then you can explain 60% of the risk, just using 7 SNVs. And at that time, Pfeffer estimated that if you would use all BC-associated SNVs, let's say at 100, then you would have a 65% explanation of the high risk and a 90% explanation of the elevated risk just over the mean. So it's feasible. And where can that lead to? So let's say you have the percentile of population, that you can divide the population in percentiles based on the risk alleles. And the 5%, upper 5%, let's say the lower 5% have a reduced risk, and have a lifetime risk of 6.1% and a 10-year risk at 50 years of 1.5. And if you look at the risk at the age at which these percentile of population has a risk of over 2.3%, then it never reaches this risk. Why 2.3%? Because this is the risk of a 26-year-old woman today. Nobody would do mammography on a 26-year-old woman today. So you could say that these patients could essentially avoid mammography or do it less frequently. And in the mean population, you would recommend normal mammography. And in the high-risk population, you would do mammography more frequently and maybe with magnetic resonance screening, because it's much more sensitive than mammography. So you could apply such a risk model to clinical decision-making for tumor, for early diagnosis, tumor prevention, let's say. And how do you develop such a polygenic risk score? You look at specific cancers and simply you add up the risk conferred by a single variant. No, that's the odds ratio for a specific SNV, and that's the number of alleles of this SNV that is present in the population in this allele. No? And you add up that for all the SNVs and you come up with a polygenic risk score. And then you look at breast cancer cases and in control women, and what actually happens is that the risk curve is shifted. It looks not so much, but it has clear consequences for classification of the risk. That's what can be observed, and there's a very good match between the observed and the theoretical curves for the distribution of risk in the population. If you compare the percentile categories of the polygenic risk score and the odds ratios actually present, there's a very good match between the observed and theoretical, so you can relatively be sure that you explain much of the risk. And if you look in the real data, the lifetime absolute risk would be this one. For if you wouldn't, that's the mean value. But if you look on the different risk score classes, then you see that there is a very wide spreading of the risk. It starts essentially at 45, and at the age of 75, the highest risk class has a 30% risk of developing cancer, whereas the lowest class has a below 5%. So that's a real difference. And that's a difference that you can consider for clinical decision-making. This has been confirmed in newer studies where you have very high numbers of cases, 94,000 cases and 75,000 controls. And this has been done like always, in a two-step study, a training set and a validation set. And in this case, a third set with a prospective test set. And I show you the data. 77 SNV polygenic risk score, the PRS 77. Then you have an overall odds ratio for overall breast cancer of 1.49. So that means 49% increase. That's 56% for estrogen receptor positive and 40% for estrogen receptor negative. If you take a 313 SMP set, then you can even increase to 65, 74, and 47%. But it doesn't increase so much if you use really 10 times more, 71, 81, and 48. But you come up to 81%. So, and in the prospective test set, this has been essentially confirmed. The numbers are a little lower, but essentially they are confirmed. So you come up to a risk definition that is close to what you observe for single genes for breast, for example, breast cancer 1 and 2. And again, what I showed you before, the age distribution has essentially been confirmed, that you come up to a 30% at 75 years. This is a recent article, a relatively recent article, that treats several diseases, coronary artery disease, atrial fibrillation, type 2 diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease, and breast cancer. And they come up with numbers that are similar, where you can you come close to monogenic diseases. No? So you can predict the risk similarly to what you can with in the presence of a clear monogenetic disease. Okay. So essentially, we have made much progress on defining the risk. And I think that in the next years, this will be transformed into clinical applications. But what if you already have cancer? What you want to know is, at the moment of the detection of the cancer, what is your risk to develop metastasis? And what are the therapies you are likely to respond to? And for that sake, molecular classification has been performed using prognostic, and prognostic signatures have been developed. Excuse me a moment, I need a sip of water. Okay, this started essentially by this work in 2001, the work of Tiruchirappalli, where she showed by gene expression profiling using microarrays that you can distinguish several classes of breast cancer, which are indicated here by a different color code. And essentially what you see are breast estrogen receptor positive cancers and estrogen receptor negative cancers. You can see that because two very different clusters are formed. I don't know whether you are familiar with this type of clustering. The branches, the length of the branches tells you the difference between two clusters. So these two big clusters are really different. And you have, for example, you can see here, that's, I guess, RP2. That's HER2 positive breast cancer, where RP2 and other genes belonging to RP2 pathway are overexpressed. And so each of these classes is characterized by specific activations of specific genes. And that was interesting because there are more classes than we knew before. Essentially, the pathologist distinguishes estrogen receptor positive, estrogen receptor negative, and HER2 positive cancer, and triple, yeah. And here, instead, you can further distinguish subclasses in the estrogen receptor positive group and in the estrogen receptor negative group that are clinically relevant. A similar thing has been done with a recurrence score, Oncotype DX, which was developed on microarrays and then transformed into a PCR-based assay that analyzed a limited number of genes that are responsible for proliferation, invasion, HER2 status, estrogen receptor status, reference genes, and some other added important genes. And in this case, we distinguish a low risk, an intermediate risk, and a high risk. And a similar procedure was presented by the group of René Bernards in Rotterdam, who developed a gene expression signature as a predictor of survival in breast cancer. And here, the patients are in the rows and the genes are in the columns. And you can nicely see that two groups can be distinguished. In the lower group, you have more red dots, that means metastasis, than in the upper part. And that's also, you can see that here are the metastasis and death of metastasis and lymph node status. And here you see that the results are relatively independent from the lymph node status. But you can, in lymph node positive patients, distinguish higher risk and lower risk patients. But you also can see that obviously the selection of the threshold, where you call it low risk or high risk, is absolutely arbitrary. And it depends on what you want to obtain. In this case, all these signatures for breast cancer aim at identifying women who have such a low risk that they do not need chemotherapy, because we know that most of the patients who receive chemotherapy and suffer from the toxicity of chemotherapy do not really need it, because they have made the majority of patients would not need chemotherapy. But so far, we cannot distinguish who needs and who doesn't need it. And the hope was that these signatures can definitely help in this decision. But this work by Reis Filho and Pushtai, published 10 years ago in Lancet, examines what has been done with the signatures so far, because you have distributions. The estrogen receptor distribution is a binary distribution. You have estrogen receptor negative and positive cases. HER2 similarly is a binary distribution where you have clearly positive cases and clearly negative cases. And you have proliferation, which instead is a continuous distribution. And when you look at the classes that are known to the pathologist, so the estrogen receptor positive HER2 negative class, the HER2 positive class, and the what we call triple negative, because these cases normally are also negative for the progesterone receptor. So that's known to the pathologist. There's no doubt the pathologist can do without genomics. And if you add just a proliferation marker, and you look at what the clinical subtypes and 70 gene signature from René Bernards distinguishes, then you see that all the low-risk cases, the blue ones, are distinct from the red ones, essentially by the proliferation status. And the same is true for the signature of the intrinsic subtypes, the one developed by Thérèse Sorli. So essentially, the pathologist can do just like the signatures do by adding proliferation markers. And that's what actually is happening in the pathologies, that you do not analyze only estrogen receptor, progesterone receptor, HER2 but you also analyze Ki67 as a proliferation marker. And so it is still questionable whether this type of molecular classification has added much to the prognostic procedure. Mainly the recurrence score is adopted by the clinics, mainly in the United States, not so much in Europe, but it's not really widely applied. Still, most of the decision making is made by the pathologist based on the pathologic data. I just show you another example, which is very interesting for a real pathological problem, because the pathologist must decide on the grade of the tumor. Grading is a measure of the morphology of the tumor, and we know that different grades have different metastatic risk and this different aggressivity in their growth. And you know that grade 1, so let's say grade 1 breast cancer normally would not receive chemotherapy, whereas grade 3 breast cancer would absolutely receive chemotherapy. But the problem is, what can we do with grade 2? And this work asked whether grade 2 is really a distinct entity or whether it's just an intermediate state between grade 1 and grade 3. And so what they did, they analyzed, they looked at the difference between grade 1 and grade 2 in grade 3 in gene expression. And here you see a panel of 128 probe sets corresponding to 97 genes that are with a false discovery rate of 0, differentially expressed in grade 1 and grade 3 cancers. No? And then they form again a polygenic risk score, similar to what I showed you before, and come up with a score that can be used for prognosis. And then they applied this one to grade 2 cancers. And what you can see that these 128 probe sets clearly distinguishing grade 1 and grade 3. In grade 2, they show a group that is more similar to grade 3 and another group that is more similar to grade 1. And if you look at the associated metastasis, it's similar. They are more frequent in the group that is more similar to the grade 3 group. Especially they are relatively early, the metastasis. So you could say we can draw a line and call this genomic grade 1 and this one genomic grade 3. This again has not widely been applied. We also have started to do signatures, because we said signatures maybe would work better if we can consider functionally genes that are functionally associated with breast cancer progression. And we started with insulin genes, insulin-related genes, because we know that obesity is a risk factor for breast cancer and is also a risk factor for breast cancer progression, because it influences estrogen synthesis. It shows insulin, it leads to insulin resistance with an upregulation of insulin and insulin-like growth factors. And it also determines an altered adipokine and cytokine production. And altogether, these three factors influence cell proliferation, cell survival, and angiogenesis of the breast cancer. And we did a similar procedure like the other signatures and came up with a score that is, again, we identified these genes that are associated with the breast cancer progression risk. And we developed a score, and when we apply it to the training set and the validation set, we see a quite good distinction of cases that later on develop metastasis and cases that didn't develop metastasis. And if you combine it with a recurrence score, you see that those that are negative for both procedures are at really low risk, and those that are at higher risk for both procedures actually have a higher risk, and there are the two intermediates that are somewhat intermediate. Other groups have then started to make integrated signatures. That means you integrate different domains, not only gene expression, but in that case also copy number alteration in breast cancers. And what you can see is that that's the frequency of copy number alterations, amplifications or deletions of specific chromosomes and the genes that are present in these regions. And if you add that, and you can distinguish 10 profiles of frequent alterations and classify breast cancer patients into these 10 groups based on the copy number alterations. And you can see that they actually have a different risk of proliferation, of progression. This is actually difficult to interpret for a clinician. So to say, this one is treated, this one is not treated, it's not possible. It's clear that the low risk and the higher risk are very distinct. But if you look at the combination, at the comparison to other risk factors, for example, the grade and size of the tumor, lymph node status, and the age, and then you look at the different risk groups, you see that some risk groups have a really elevated risk. Normally, lymph node status for the clinician is a very important risk factor, but you see that several of these have a much higher risk than the lymph node status. Now, that are important markers. So we can say today that not much of these signatures have really been adopted by the clinics, and that still, in most cases, breast cancer prognosis is made by the pathologist on the classical factors: receptor status, HER2 status, and proliferation, plus lymph nodal status. That normally makes the decision, and age is also a little bit taken into account, because we know that younger women have a higher risk to develop metastasis. That's also, I would say, it's also due to the fact that in our countries, in the Western world, and I don't know the situation in India, but maybe you can tell me, we have health systems for the whole population, and everything is based on the classical model of pathology. So it's very difficult to change that procedure. So if I would like to, if my aim would be to introduce molecular signatures instead of standard pathology procedures, I would have to show that they are better than pathology procedures. Essentially, they are not that much better. But if I would be, let's say, health minister in a country that has no general health system and is just developing a health system, then I would say it would be much less expensive if you would substitute pathology with automated genomic procedures that can be centralized and that can be at least as good as the pathologist. But that's obviously an opinion. So why are prognostic signatures, let's say, why are they so bad? Why aren't they much better than what the pathologist does? Why can all that information that we obtain from gene expression or copy number alteration not lead to a much better estimation of the risk to develop metastasis? And that's why we analyzed the limits of prognostic signatures. And what we did was that we simply took many different biological processes that are linked to metastasis: cell-cell signaling, cell death, cell growth, cell proliferation, kinase, metabolism, single transcription, regulator activity, and developed for each of these biological processes a signature. And what you can see is that each single signature has a relatively good distinction between metastatic and non-metastatic cases. So you see in pink the metastasis, and in dark brown the non-metastatic cases. You must always consider that non-metastasis can mean that the patient will never have metastasis. It can also mean he hasn't had metastasis in the time of follow-up, but maybe she has later. Or maybe she hasn't had metastasis because she responded to therapy. So to have non-metastatic cases in the high-risk class is not much of a problem. The problem is if you have high-risk cases in the low-risk class, because that means that are patients who are at high risk, but you would not give them chemotherapy. And that could mean that some of them dies of disease, although chemotherapy could have saved her life. So the problem are the misclassifications where you have a high-risk case that is classified as a low-risk case. And as I said, you can see that you always have one cluster with high risk and one cluster with low risk, and so on. You see that in all the different signatures that we developed. And if we take them all together, you still have misclassifications. So major part of metastases are in the higher risk cluster, but there are, in this case, there are, I think, 6 cases in the low risk group. Although these two groups are clearly distinct, you can see that from the gene expression signature. So why? I don't have all the details. I can tell you, we analyzed these cases in detail. So we took these cases and compared them to higher risk cases for all the genes, just these 6 cases. And we showed that they are simply very similar to low risk cases. So they are indistinguishable on the basis of gene expression. And that's likely due to the fact that metastatization is a probabilistic process. Any invasive tumor can metastasize, yet it does so with a different probability that depends on its molecular nature. And you can distinguish the molecular nature, but you cannot, but it's not absolute. It's impossible to predict the metastatic risk with absolute accuracy. There's no absolute signature. And this is likely comes from the fact that metastasis is determined by pre-existing factors like the cellular background, where the tumor comes from, and the genetic background of the patient. You have environmental factors, the stroma and inflammation, and you might have even diet and physical activity. And you have stochastic effects, that's the transforming mutations and additional mutations that come later. And all these factors determine the risk of metastasis. What we measure with the gene expression is mainly the effect of the cellular background. You get a clear signature for luminal and basal breast cancers, so estrogen receptor positive, estrogen receptor negative cancers, because they derive from different cells, from the luminal cell or from the basal cell. And to some degree also from the transforming mutations. Now, if you start with a certain mutation, you have a certain expression profile, but even that is not so strong. The strongest fact is the cellular background. So, as I said, all the other factors contribute, and so there is a probability for any invasive cancer, and you cannot absolutely distinguish those that will develop metastasis from those that will not. Even the best signature will misclassify some tumors. I'm not sure whether we are already at the maximum, but the interest of the scientific community has much drifted to another aspect, because you could identify the risk of metastasis by liquid biopsy. So you could, sometime after surgery, you could analyze the blood of the patient, and you would expect that after surgery, circulating tumor cells or material released from the tumor, DNA, RNA, microRNAs, whatsoever, by time they go down. Unless you have a metastasis, then they will never go down completely. And especially they will rise after a while. And that's what's tried to be done with liquid biopsy, but I will not go into detail on that. Okay, I would make a break. I need a break, maybe you too. Let's see again in about 10 minutes, okay?
Yes, yes, take your time, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So we can start again if you wish.
Yes, sir. Yes, we can start.
Okay, so I've seen there are no questions. Please do not hesitate to write your questions in the chat so that I can answer.
Yes.
So you can see my presentation?
Yes, sir, it is visible.
Okay.
Yes.
So just some word on cancer genome sequencing and breast cancer.
Okay.
We already talked about next generation sequencing, all the different applications and the list of machines that are available today. Most of the applications are performed on Illumina because it has become Illumina and Ion Torrent are the most used ones. So these are early studies on breast cancer dedicated to receptor positive or triple negative or both of them. And the genes identified, frequently mutated genes are shown here. Again, we find the MAP3 kinase 1 and PI3K. We find subtype specific mutations, and we find many mutations in drug targets. There is an idea on clonal evolution and many combinations of cancer gene mutations. And in the later study, a new fusion gene had been identified. So breast cancer has a relatively high mutation frequency, and the study of aromatase inhibitor sensitive and resistant breast cancer, you know that aromatase inhibitors are used for estrogen receptor positive breast cancer because in the postmenopausal woman, most of the only source of estrogens is the adipose tissue, where aromatase can transform testosterone into estrogen. And so if you block that transformation, the woman is essentially devoid of estrogens. That's complete estrogen ablation. And you see that the resistant cancers show more mutations than the sensitive cancers, in line with our perception that the cancer, the more it is mutated, the higher the risk of therapy resistant is. No, if we speak on drug therapy, not immunotherapy. And that's the numbers compared to other cancers, where you see that melanoma, as I already told you, melanoma and lung cancer carry much more mutations than breast cancer. That's a way to show mutations after sequencing that are the aromatase inhibitor sensitive and the resistant cancers, where you see you have the mutations are identified as single bars here, and the translocations are identified by these lines that link one chromosome to the other. The circle are the 23 chromosomes. The most frequent mutations are p53 mutations. Like in most cancers, p53 is extremely frequent, and PI3K mutations in breast cancer. Almost a third of breast cancers carries mutations in PI3K, and then other less frequent mutations show up, among which also MAP3 kinase 1. And in such a diagram of the mutation landscape, you also see the number of mutations per megabase, so the mutation burden of the single tumor. Each column is a single tumor. And you see the number of synonymous and non-synonymous mutations. And you can see the type of mutation. In red, you have CPG becomes a T, C in a context of ACTD becomes a T, or C becomes G or A, and so on, the different types of mutations. And then you normally show by these bars the clinical characteristics or pathological characteristics of the tumor. In this case, you have the expression subtype according to the signature of Sorley, what we call the intrinsic subtype, signature luminal A, luminal B, and so on. The histology, ductal carcinoma in situ, lobular, or other. Most are ductal cancers here. And the grade, 1, 2, 3, and the stage of the tumor. Perhaps the main outcome from this analysis is that you have many different genes that mutate in breast cancer, and with a different frequency in different subtypes of breast cancer. But essentially, all these mutations in some way act in the same pathway. Here, and that's shown here, no? That you have PI3K, KRAS mutations, BRAF mutations that are not so. The dimension of the field is shows the frequency of the mutations. So BRAF mutations are rare, but MAP3K1 are more often. And you see activating mutations, so likely oncogenic mutations shown in pink, and inactivating mutations, so mutations that act likely in tumor suppressor genes in blue, or in light blue. And at the end, they all act in cell death and cell cycle progression. So the two main hallmarks of cancer, no? Avoidance of cell death, anti-apoptotic activity, and cell cycle progression. Because if the cell doesn't proliferate, it's not a tumor. What you also can see by sequencing is the clonal prevalence, the clonal frequency of the single mutation. So that's, if you would find it in all the cells, then you would have it here at 1.0. You don't see it in all the cells, even those genes like this one, like Greek 2, TP53, ABCC9, that are likely driving mutations. They might be present in all of the tumor, but you have some non-tumoral cells in the specimen. And so you can distinguish driver activity from other genes that are not primary drivers. So they have developed later on during tumorigenesis and are present only in a part of the tumor, of a heterogeneous tumor. No? That's what also has been done for the study of tumor heterogeneity and clonal evolution of the tumor. Taken together, and I'm a little rapid on that because we do not have so much time, we have a highly variable number of mutations, and a high number of mutations are associated with more aggressive disease. Mutations cluster in genes belonging to specific pathways associated with proliferation and anti-apoptosis. Several genes are mutated with high frequency and are so common driver genes in breast cancer. Many mutations are almost private and with a dubious contribution to tumor progression. Several mutated genes show polymorphisms that were already associated with breast cancer risk in genome-wide association studies, for example, MAP3 kinase 1. And the identification of putative driver mutations is possible by frequency and predominance. And you have many actionable mutations, many mutations in genes for which we have drugs. So in principle, it is possible to treat patients on the basis of the mutations you find. So coming back to tumor evolution models, you could expect a linear model and a completely random model of tumor development, where you have, in this case, you have one mutation after the other, and you have a clear line of mutations that you find in many cancers, and they have a clearly distinct, they are found in a clearly distinct proportion of the tumor. Or you can have a driver mutation and then randomly many other mutations that lead to many other cancers. And what really comes out is something like that, that you have different pathways of different mutation pathways that are not absolutely, can be to some degree interconnected. So you have no clear pathway, but you have not even a completely random situation. The mutation spectrum observed in breast cancers is compatible with the existence of a preferred but not exclusive mutation pathway. Is that relevant for breast cancer therapy? Each case actually belongs to a subtype but has unique features. Future therapy must address the specific individual mutation pattern. That means all cancers must be sequenced. We should sequence all cancers. Clinical action mutations have been identified, and we have to check whether this always indicates the possibility to treat with success the cancer. Many different mutations confer drug resistance, like shown for the aromatase inhibitors, and that has been taken into account. And we should develop drugs for all driving mutations. This study has looked at the mutations in the metastasis. We know from the expression studies that the primary tumor and the metastasis are not so different. At the beginning of breast cancer genomics, we thought that we could identify clear metastasis driving genes, but that is not the case. So most of the decision whether the tumor will likely produce metastasis or not is taken early on during cancer evolution. And here we look at the mutations, and what you can see is, you see the frequency of the mutation in the primary tumor and in light blue, and in the metastatic disease in dark blue. And you see that some mutations increase, like PI3K, like TP3. So the main drivers increase, especially the estrogen receptor mutations increase, because estrogen receptor mutations are not really a primary driver mutation, because the estrogen receptor in itself is driving tumorigenesis. Because if you have many estrogens, then the estrogen receptor, there's some noise in the line. Can everybody switch off the microphone? The estrogen receptor confers an oncogenic signal just in its native state. But under therapy, where you block estrogen receptor signaling, then mutations occur, are selected for estrogen receptor that do not respond anymore to the estrogen receptor inhibitor, no? The anti-estrogens. That's why we find more mutations in the metastasis that grow despite anti-estrogen receptor therapy, especially in the estrogen receptor positive group. But you don't find them in the triple negative, because they have not been treated with estrogens, anti-estrogens. In the HER2 group, because there is a part of HER2 tumors that are also estrogen receptor positive. There you have again that same phenomenon. What we also see is that from a heterogeneous tumor, under hormonal therapy, we have outgrowth of metastasis that have different characteristics. They might have estrogen receptor 1 mutations, 18%. They might have MYC or other transcription factor mutations that evade hormonal therapy, and they can have mutations in the MAP kinase pathway, because that's alternative to estrogen receptor signaling. So you get a pro-proliferation signal that is not dependent on estrogen, and that is a way to resist against hormonal therapy. And still 60% are resistant for unknown reasons. What you also can see here is, again, the story with the primary and metastatic mutations. But what you can also see that dependent on the mutation, you have not completely random selection of the metastatic site. No, you see, for example, if you take the estrogen receptor, mutated cancers go mainly to the liver, the CDH1 mutated through the bowel, and so on. So there's the mutation that occurs in the in the way to the metastatic site. There's a selection of the metastatic site. Okay. Are there questions? Are there questions that I can answer? Not in the chat room?
Not, sir. Not a questions.
Okay, then I go ahead. Okay. So that the next, I have decided to take the next 3 lectures together in one, because it's on chemo prevention. And I make a talk on that considers basics of chemo prevention, the concept of targeted prevention. And I show essentially two experiences with specific drugs, with drug repurposing, aspirin and curcumin. Curcumin is not a drug, but okay, there's a question I will answer. Who should be having mammograms and how often? So the consensus today is that women over 50 should have a mammography once each 2 years. That's in the absence of any consideration of the specific risk. If you are at specific risk because of familiar risk, because you have your mother, also first grade relatives have had breast cancer, then you should do mammography each year and start eventually earlier. But as I told in the presentation, we could modify this recommendation based on the genetic risk. But that means we are not yet at that point. So we don't have panels that are clinically validated and that can be used for everyday decision making. That's a potential, but still it's not in action. Yes. I hope I have asked. Okay, so as I told you, I'll talk on chemo prevention and 2 examples, aspirin and curcumin. Curcumin because it's in my interest since a long time, and maybe it's also an interest for you because I know that in India, curcumin is much used in the diet. So it's there's another question. Oh no, okay. Okay, so let me start with the second part. And okay, can you see it? Can you see the presentation?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay,
Perfect.
great. Primary cancer prevention. We know that 1 in 2 men and 1 in 3 women will receive a cancer diagnosis at some point in their life. That's really much. I normally show this slide and people do not believe, but I have checked by all the means. It's like that. Let's say that's based on the prevalence of cancer in the United States and in Western Europe. So it's different in other countries, I know. But essentially, everybody is at risk. But that also means everybody is eligible for prevention. So we should do prevention. I already showed you this slide. Fortunately, cancers do not grow without any obstacle. Then they would grow exponentially and we would die very soon after the development of the cancer. Cancers develop slowly in time in a linear growth pattern. And they are diagnosed when they have reached a certain dimension or when they give symptoms. Early diagnosis can anticipate that time, but the dissemination of metastasis has already started before. So you have a time before the cancer disseminates at the time after the start of dissemination. But even in the case of early diagnosis, you already have cancer dissemination. So you can already have a cancer that later will develop metastasis. That means prevention must start here. And that means it must start in completely healthy persons, because at that time, even if they have a tumor, you don't know about it. So you must do prevention in healthy people. The primary prevention of cancer can consist in lifestyle interventions, smoking, alcohol, diet, physical activity. For example, the American Heart Association said that on average, a woman in the United States consumes 22% more calories a day than they did in 71, and men consume 10% more. And a third of adults do not undertake any physical activity. And we know that obesity, diet, and physical activity are linked to the cancer risk. You can use natural dietary compounds, antioxidants, anti-inflammatory compounds, omega-3 compounds, and you could use chemopreventive compounds. And that means compounds that are drugs that are well tolerated without any toxicity, or natural compounds that are administered like a drug. Again, the risk factors I showed you before, and we have the blue ones that are actionable: lifestyle, environmental, reproductive history. But essentially, you could also, knowing the genetic predisposition, if you know the mechanisms by which all the, let's say, the endogenous hormones, you know the mechanisms, then you can also act on these. So prevention can also address genetic risk. You know, exposure to carcinogens, genetic risk, diet and lifestyle determine your individual risk, but still much of it is just bad luck. But prevention can also act on bad luck, because the chance that an error is made during replication might depend on many factors. And still, even the DNA repair can be influenced. So we have essentially many aspects of your individual risk that can be in some way addressed by, at least in principle, addressed by chemoprevention. So often prevention is taken synonymous for early diagnosis. So mammography, for example, is not cancer prevention, it's early diagnosis. And what's the difference? If you look at the natural history of a tumor, you are healthy. At some time there occurs transformation in just one cell. The tumor growth, you are not aware of it. It starts disseminating. You are not aware of that. And then there's a major diagnosis. Short after diagnosis, normally the primary tumor is removed by surgery, and then you receive adjuvant therapy. If you are a responder after adjuvant therapy, you are healthy. Obviously, somebody is already healthy after surgery, fortunately. And then eventually you will die from other diseases. If you are a non-responder and have a metastatic risk, then the tumor will grow and will determine death by cancer at an earlier time. If you do screening, you will anticipate diagnosis. You will detect it earlier, and then you will treat and have a long life after treatment with adjuvant therapy. If you are a responder, if you are a non-responder, not so much changes. You just anticipate the diagnosis. Obviously, the chances of being a responder is higher the earlier you find the tumor, because it has had less time to disseminate. But still, in the case of a very aggressive cancer, early diagnosis, if you do not respond to adjuvant therapy, then not so much changes. You know earlier that you are a cancer patient, but it doesn't change. Primary prevention instead aims at an elongation of the healthy lifespan. So here's an arrow. Essentially, transformation and dissemination could also be affected. But let's say, even if transformation and dissemination occurs at the same time, you could try to elongate the phase of healthy life before diagnosis, and then you have the same evolution that you have normally in cancer. And that means you have an absolute gain in lifetime, and especially in healthy lifetime. That's here. So that's, if you consider that most of our studies are aimed at metastatic patients and the successes are not so many, prevention, on the other hand, could really extend lives of healthy people. The concept of chemoprevention was, and the term was coined by Michael B. Spawn from the NIH in the United States, and later on in Dartmouth College. Chemoprevention consists in the use of natural, synthetic, or biological agents to reverse, suppress, or prevent either the initial phases of carcinogenesis or progression of pre-malignant cells to invasive disease. And Michael Spawn, in all his life, he is now 89 years old, focused on selective COX-2 inhibitors. So because we know of aspirin, which is a COX-2 inhibitor, but it's not selective, it also inhibits COX-1. Selective binding to retinoid X receptors, racinoids, SERMs, so selective estrogen receptor modifiers, and PPR ligands, because estrogen has already shown activity as a drug, anti-estrogens. So, and we know that estrogen exposure in your lifetime is related to your breast cancer risk. No? So you could do chemoprevention using anti-estrogens. In my personal opinion, Michael B. Spawn went ahead to develop many synthetic drugs. I much prefer natural compounds, because normally natural compounds have the advantage that we already know of toxicities. Let's say if you take curcumin, curcumin is a normal dietary component, and we know it has actually no toxicity. And that's confirmed by clinical studies where you can take up to 12 grams a day and you have no toxicity. Whereas any synthetic compound, before we can say it really has no toxicity, it's really, really hard, because curcumin has been taken by millions of people and is normally taken by millions of people. New drugs, before we can say it, it's really hard. We can say that to a certain extent for aspirin, because it's for more than 120 years now, and I think it was 1897 when aspirin was developed. So it's 125 years. And we know almost all the side effects, and we can really well evaluate the toxicities. Okay. Because when we do chemo prevention, we have a population, and the population can be of low risk. That's almost everybody, the general population. Most of us have the normal risk. We obviously do not accept side effects. We can do lifestyle interventions, smoking cessation, environmental protection, physical activity, diet, reproductive health. And in the absence, we have, so this population has no specific genetic risk factors and no familiarity. The intermediate risk population, that are many, still they do not accept side effects, because still we need to treat healthy people, and we could do non-toxic prevention, curcumin, other polyphenols, metformin. I'm not going to talk on metformin today, but it's been proposed because it controls the metabolism in our organism. And this intermediate risk population likely has a weak familiarity or single nucleotide variant-based risk factors. The high-risk population, that are very few, they could accept minor side effects because they know they have a really elevated risk. And we could do low toxicity prevention, for example, with tamoxifen or aromatase inhibitors, aspirin, bisphosphonates, statins. They likely have cancer gene mutations and a relatively strong familiarity. So we can say that that's the population dimension, that are the tolerated side effects, and that's the risk. Now, there's a clear conceptual correlation between the risk and the side effects you can accept. So for the main population, we cannot accept side effects. But targeted prevention is a concept I have tried to develop. Targeted prevention means we know your risk, your genetic risk, your environmentally determined risk, and your lifestyle risk. So actually, at the first point, I would interact on your lifestyle. If you are a heavy smoker, I would say targeted prevention consists in smoking cessation, no? But that might not always be possible. So, but still we know your risk. We know that this specific type of risk is associated with a specific tumor. And we know the molecular characteristics of the tumor. And then we can say you are at risk of developing a specific cancer more than other people in the population. So we can do something that considers these molecular characteristics. So let's say, in simplest case, you are genetically at risk for estrogen receptor positive breast cancer. We know estrogen receptor positive breast cancer develops in correlation with the lifelong exposure to estrogens. Then we can use anti-estrogens to prevent this specific cancer. That would be targeted prevention. If we knew more about risk factors, like we know for estrogen receptor breast cancer, if we knew more about other cancers and other risk factors, we know already much on molecular characteristics of tumors, then we could develop many, many approaches to targeted prevention. And as an example for that, so that's even more, that's secondary prevention, because that's, no, let's say, this one is an experience from secondary cases, but if you have colorectal cancer with a PI3K mutation, and you give to these patients aspirin, then you have a much reduced colorectal cancer specific mortality as compared to those who do not take aspirin. And that also holds for the overall mortality. Aspirin gives an advantage, but you do not see any advantage in cases that have wild-type PI3K. No advantage, neither in colorectal cancer-specific mortality and no advantage in overall mortality. You could even say that there might be a slight disadvantage. So that's targeted prevention. In this case, secondary prevention, because it's done on patients who already had colorectal cancer. So why aspirin? Aspirin, we know that non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, among which aspirin, inhibit COX-2 and COX-1. COX-2 is inducible, COX-1 is constitutive. Both enzymes are active in the synthesis of prostaglandins, and prostaglandins are associated with inflammation. And there are selective COX-2 inhibitors. So there have been conducted several prevention studies in colorectal cancer, and they all show an advantage in a relative risk with aspirin use. Sulindac is a COX-2 specific selective COX inhibitor, just like celecoxib. And here I have indicated the group with the lowest, highest effect, the lowest relative risk. There were several groups with different dosages, and the highest dosage has had the lowest risk. So an advantage in all these studies. But again, I say celecoxib has maybe an even stronger effect, but we know much less on the side effects. We know that it has not the side effect to act also on COX-1, which on the contrary does aspirin. But this other study that took into account many studies that analyzed aspirin for primary prevention of cancer, not only colorectal cancer, but any type of cancer, and they didn't see any type of effect. So the meta-analysis yielded an almost no effect. But they saw an effect in the side effects. Bleeding events. Aspirin is associated with bleeding events. So this would not recommend to use aspirin for cancer prevention. But if you look at the effect on colorectal cancer, if you know you are at risk because of familiarity or because of your SNVs, then you might take into account some risk of bleeding events when using aspirin. And that's a very recent analysis done by the Preventive Services Task Force in the United States, a systematic review for all the effects of of aspirin. So you have cardiovascular diseases, colorectal cancer mortality, and the harms of taking aspirin. And you see some effect on the cardiovascular risk, some effect, but very unclear if you compare different aspects. These are randomly controlled trials, and this is an observational study. And you see in all studies, you see some effect on bleeding. So the task force comes to the conclusion low-dose aspirin was associated with small absolute risk reductions in major cardiovascular disease events and small absolute increases in major bleeding. Colorectal cancer results were less robust and highly variable. So on that base, the task force does not recommend to use low-dose aspirin. Neither for, it was before recommended for cardiovascular disease, but it is now not anymore recommended for cardiovascular disease in people over 50, people under 50 can consider it. Yet the story is not over because, again, a relatively recent study of the use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs and PI3K altered head and neck cancer, where you see in cases without mutation or amplification of the PI3K gene, you do not see any effect on disease-specific survival, but you see a dramatic effect in those that carry mutation or PI3K amplification. And that's true for disease-specific survival and overall survival. So this again hints at an effect of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, aspirin. So now I would come to my favorite subject. I'm studying curcumin since many, many years, and it's not easy because mainstream oncology in Europe, especially in Italy, it's a little different in Germany, but mainstream oncology does not consider so much, neither prevention, nor, and much less so, prevention using natural substances. This can be explained because, I mean, oncology has been started by oncologists. Oncologists are physicians who see patients with cancer and they want to do something. So they need research to be able to do more. Prevention is on healthy people. No physician sees healthy people. So, okay, they go to the basic doctor, to the general practitioner, but nobody cares for their cancer risk. And on the other hand, I must say that curcumin, there are many, many articles on curcumin, and a good proportion of these articles are not really serious, are low quality studies. And it's a little bit hard to convince people that studying curcumin can really make a difference. But let me start from the beginning. Curcumin is a spice extracted, I don't have to tell you, you all know it, from the roots of Curcuma longa. It's a component of curry used in traditional medicine in India and in China for the control of inflammation. The dietary intake can be observed to up to 0.1 grams per kilogram body weight. So that means, let's say, 7 grams a day for a 70 kilo person like me. You can see that in India, I don't know whether you can confirm that, but that's the data I found in the literature. It's registered at the food colorant in the European Union. It's the food colorant A01, so the first food colorant. So that also means it's absolutely non-toxic. No side effects are known. Well, I have to say that some people who start taking large quantities of curcumin may have some diarrhea at the beginning. And I looked yesterday at the clinicaltrials.gov, and there are 286 studies registered that use in some way curcumin. So there is research going on, and it is being considered. We started a long time ago by analyzing the molecular mechanisms of curcumin, and we showed that it inhibits proliferation of, in this case, breast cancer cells. It induces apoptosis, that you can also see by annexin 5 and propidium iodide staining, in especially early apoptosis. That was likely to be due to downregulation of NFKB, as you can see here, with growing amounts of curcumin in the band shift assay. That's NFKB bound to DNA. That's the free NFKB, and you see that the more curcumin you give, the less NFKB is bound to the promoter of genes. So that's a promoter with the NFKB binding element. And you can also see phosphorylation of IKB and phosphorylation of the P65 subunit of NFKB increases. And that means that IKB is inactivated and destined to degradation in the proteasome, and NFKB, the mature NFKB, can go into the nucleus, as you can see here, where it can activate NFKB-dependent genes. And to identify, we have NFKB-dependent expression of matrix metalloproteases at the RNA level, protein level, excuse me, I didn't silence my cell phone. At the protein level and at the activity level in an assay that is zymography, where you have in the gel, you have proteins that can be degraded by the enzyme, and you see the bands when there has occurred degradation, and the activity of MMPs is inhibited, gelatin-containing gels. We then did a microarray study to identify genes that are differentially expressed after administration of curcumin, and here you see some of them. Essentially, it's COX-2, the inflammatory cytokines CXCL1 and 2, and the EGR1 and other genes go up, associated with the antioxidant level in the cell. And we focus a little bit on the inflammatory cytokines because they are really important for inflammation. And we confirmed by quantitative PCR that they are actually regulated by curcumin, CXCL1 and 2. Do you see my presentation still? Everybody can see me. Okay. And by Western blot, again, we see that's also true at the protein level, and we confirmed also by ELISA. And it has also effects on expression of microRNAs, as you can say here, and we analyzed in more detail MIR181B, that is also associated in the regulation of inflammation and known breast cancer microRNA. And you see that it regulates, it targets CXCL1 and inhibition of this microRNA can lower the level of CXCL1 secreted into the medium. So at that time, we had developed a signature for metastasis, so they're related to the extracellular matrix. So all the genes that are important in the extracellular matrix or in the tumor microenvironment, and there are many genes that have an influence on the development of metastasis. You see here in the training set and in the validation set that you see differences according to the expression of these genes. So we went on to analyze several of these genes of metastasis mediators after CXCL1 silencing. CXCL1 is downregulated by curcumin. We here show that we block CXCL1 and you see it's actually blocked. And you see that all of these metastasis modifiers are inhibited after CXCL1 silencing. So that's an effect of an indirect effect of curcumin. And we then asked whether this translates into inhibition of the formation of metastasis. And yes, it does. We injected breast cancer cells or lung cancer cells or prostate cancer cells in the tail vein of mice and analyzed the lung metastasis formed in the tuchus, and see that in mice treated with curcumin, in this case curcumin via the diet, we had significantly less metastasis in the lungs for both breast and prostate. So that's to say, that's formation of metastasis, and that's what occurs long before diagnosis. But that's addressable with curcumin, because you can take curcumin long before diagnosis, because it's absolutely non-toxic. So that's a cartoon just to show the many effects of curcumin. It acts on NF-kappa B, on AP1, CXCL1, CXCL2, that is related to metastasis-related gene invasion, MMPs, apoptosis. And we also have shown that there are effects on the estrogen receptor and estrogen-stimulated proliferation, which I didn't show you here. And this all contributes to the development of metastasis, which can be blocked by curcumin. But we always said the main target of curcumin is NF-kappa B. And especially we thought that curcumin would inhibit I-kappa-kappa, the I-kappa kinase, which phosphorylates IKB. IKB is an inhibitor of NF-kB. It keeps NF-kB in the cytosol. And when it's phosphorylated by IKK, it is destinated to the proteasome. And then NF-kB is free to go into the nucleus and to activate the inflammatory transcriptional program. But then this study from Banerjee and colleagues from Ireland, they showed that the real target is a proteasomal kinase. And that explains why we see the NF-kB effects, because IKB is degraded in the proteasome. If the proteasome isn't functioning anymore, IKB cannot be destroyed, and it keeps NF-kB in the cytoplasm. And at more or less the same time, we showed that curcumin also has metabolic effects. We showed so on 4 different cell lines, in this case mice cell line, because we also did in vivo studies. And you can see it blocks ATP synthase. Block of ATP synthase leads to a reduction of ATP available in the cell and a reduced ATP-AMP ratio and reduced O2 oxygen consumption. whether measured on pyruvate or succinate, you see the same effect. And docking studies show that curcumin actually binds to the FO subunit of the ATP synthase. So that's another direct target. And at the moment, we are analyzing whether these two effects, DIRK2 inhibition and inhibition of ATP synthase, are in some way connected. We believe they aren't, so that are two different aspects, but we have to show. And the ATP synthase activity also underlines effects described for curcumin on the metabolism and on obesity. And that's what we would like to. It has also been described as a calorie restriction mimetic. So it's not actually that you take curcumin and then you lose weight, but it might in some way change the energy metabolism in your cells. And we still have to show it's much likely that because the ATP synthase from tumor cells and normal cells is identical, so it is likely to act also on normal cells. So the translational aspects, chemoprevention with curcumin, it's not so easy. We have to identify inflammation-related risk factors. So we would need to know who is at risk for cancer or for cardiovascular disease because of inflammation. And there's an issue with bioavailability. Curcumin is poorly uptaken by the intestine. But and there are many studies to enhance bioavailability by producing liposomes or derivatives of curcumin that are more bioavailable. But what is missing are studies that show that more bioavailable compounds have more of an effect. My doubt is that curcumin mainly acts in the intestine by changing inflammation in the intestine and indirectly in the whole body, because we know that intestine inflammation translates into the body. And it might also do so by changing the microorganisms that live in the intestine. So it might have metagenomic effects. We would need clinical trials. I would like to run a trial with people who have never taken curcumin and to see the changes in the metagenome of their intestine once they start to take curcumin. And there's an issue with intellectual property because nobody finances clinical trials with curcumin, because if the clinical trial would come up with the information that it is highly active, then everybody could sell curcumin, and the company who paid for the clinical trial wouldn't have any advantage. And clinical trials are very expensive. But it would be very important because it could be a strategy to treat many healthy people and really prevent cancer. Okay. Okay, I would have finished.
Yes.
And there is a question. I'm not sure whether I understand well that question. So one oncogene could influence another type of gene for a different type of cancer. So interaction, you are asking about the interaction of genes. I mean, there are interaction of genes. I told you that we have seen interactions between PI3K and MAP3 kinase 1. But we have still to learn more about that, I would say. So there are essentially there are interactions. I also have shown last time the interaction of GNAQ with TET2, and they have different effects in different cancers. So that's the main theme, is that each oncogene is an oncogene only in a specific context. For example, BRAF, which is a very often mutated gene, is present in many, many melanomas, in some colorectal cancers, in a few breast cancers, but essentially not in other cancers. So each oncogene has a specific profile of cancers where it can act. And that simply depends on the makeup of the molecular makeup of the specific cell. So that's why the origin of the cell is so important. I hope I have responded well to the question. If not, reformulate it, please. No. What are the mechanisms underlying hepatitis B virus-associated non-hepatocellular cancers? That's a good question. That's very specific, and I must confess, I don't know. I'm not so informed on. I can look for it. I can ask a colleague, but I don't know. Thank you for the question, but I must admit I can't respond. Breastfeeding is oncopreventive, yes, because normally during breastfeeding you don't have this menstrual cycle, and that means it's a time where you are not exposed to estrogens. So breastfeeding is oncopreventive.
Okay.
I don't know whether there are studies, because in some places women try to breastfeed for a very long time, and I don't know whether this has been analyzed, how long time breastfeeding. But normally I think that even in long time breastfeeding, the menstrual cycle restarts, even if still breastfeeding. If the patient identified with cancer due to gene mutation, is it possible to replace the mutated gene, or what will be the next therapy? So to replace gene, or everything that we did with gene therapy, has one major drawback. You must do it on all the cells, because if you leave out one cell, this cell could start over again. And that's true for oncogenes, where you would have to repair the oncogene, so to silence the mutation, and you have to do it in all the cells. No, there's maybe even if you think of stem cell theory, then you have to do it in all the stem cells of the tumor, and the stem cells are even less accessible. And the same is true for tumor suppressor genes, because all the cells are lacking tumor suppressor gene, and you have to introduce a copy of a functioning gene, and you have to do so on all the cells, unless the other ones will grow. So gene therapy could work with strong bystander effects. So you reach to transfect some cells, but these cells produce something that kills all the other cells. That has been tried with toxic proteins or something like that are secreted in the microenvironment, but it didn't really work out. I think there would be a chance in using gene therapy to enhance immunotherapy effects. But but that's essentially CAR T therapy, no, that I presented. But maybe there could be other immune stimulating therapies. No, you transfect some cells that more T cells are attracted to the tumor and then kill the tumor. So that's even true in the area of CRISPR-Cas. No, next time I will a little bit talk on new methods. We have now gene editing, but still it's much more efficacious in vivo, but still you cannot obtain all cells. No, you can modify editing of all a gene in all cells. Can we develop animal models to mimic immunotherapy response of cancer patients? That's a very beautiful question, because that's what we actually do. So I have shown you the B16F10 model, but it's not really a good model because it has no BRAF, no NRAS mutation, not even a c-KIT mutation. It's not really similar to human melanomas, but it's essentially the only model we have. We are also replicating the study in RIM1 model, which is similar, but just it's a little bit, it's other mutations, another cell line, but still it's not really nice model. What we are trying to do is to develop new models that really reflect the human situation. No? There are some genetically engineered models, but we more than else point to a real, because if you have genetically engineered models, either you have the mutation in all the tissues, or you have very complex induction systems that you get expression of the mutation only in specific tissues, and it's never as specific as it's in a normal tumor. So what we are working on are cell lines that are modified in vitro to reflect exactly what happens in a specific human tumor. And that would be ideal to test immunotherapy in the mouse, and still you have the difference between the immune systems. No? We have mouse models where we have completely destroyed the mouse immune system, and we can inject human immune cells in order to have a chimeric immune system. But normally then the immune system of the human immune system sooner or later develops graft versus host disease. So it's very limited and it's very expensive. So we aim at good mouse models, and still we have the difference between the immune system of man and mice. Okay, if we have still time left, I don't remember the plan for today. Can you help me, Dr. Selvamani?
Yes, sir. It is only the schedule of lectures. We don't have any time specified for it.
Okay, okay.
It's 1:30 onwards, because I
wish I can add another lecture, but I have to look at that. Let me look.
Yes.
Let's make 5-10 minutes pause.
Yes.
10 minutes break, so I can find the other talk, and then we start over again. Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Take your time. Take your time.
Okay, I'm ready. I have found my presentation.
Yes, yes.
So because I thought it could be interesting also in relation to the question of, in consideration of the question to interaction of oncogenes.
Okay.
And I will show you one of these interactions.
Nice.
Okay. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, sir. We could see.
Okay. Okay, so I show you the association of a single nucleotide variants at 5q11.2 with PI3K somatic mutations in estrogen receptor alpha positive breast cancers. A study that we published some years ago. So essentially, what I already told you in the lecture before, we have high penetrance, low incidence genes like BRCA1, so that are the high risk mutations, and we have many common modest risk alleles. So now today we think it's in the number of hundreds of genes that in some way influence breast cancer. And I also showed you that they are specific for subtypes, for example, for estrogen receptor positive. And that's why we ask, are breast cancer risk variants associated with specific somatic mutations in breast cancers? So the question is whether cancers with a specific mutation preferentially develop on a background with specific alleles of risk-associated variant loci. And how did we do that? We selected estrogen receptor positive breast cancer associated, well-validated SNVs that are in or close to the coding sequence, so that have a likely effect on the coding or the expression of the gene. We used initially the public data sets from Ellis et al. And then the Cancer Genome Atlas data set. We got the somatic mutations from the annotations, and we had extracted raw sequence data in order to identify the variant alleles. And then we did the association analysis. And this was not really easy because we had 30 gigabytes of data, and we had to develop tools ad hoc for the data extraction. That might be easier right now. So what we came up with is with this list of 21, I think it's 21 if I remember well, breast cancer susceptibility variants from the Ellis data set. And we looked at the association with PI3K mutation, which is the most frequent one, MAP3 kinase 1 mutation, and TP53. And what you can see, the odds ratio, especially for the PI3K, we detected several alleles that have a high odds ratio. That means that the SNV is, these SNVs are associated with PI3K. That means a specific allele is more frequent in PI3K muted cases than in PI3K wild type cases. So that's our training cohort, and we did then a validation on the TCGA cohort, and you can see that p-value obviously dropped, but we have still some variants where we have an odds ratio So two significant variants with an odds ratio that was significant. So we focus on these two. That means these two are in a region that has been fine mapped, because already it contains 3 genes, MAP3 kinase 1, set domain 9, and MIR3. And exactly our variants are close to ZD9. This has been fine mapped because it's already a breast cancer risk associated locus, because there's MAP3 K1 in it. And so we know much about this region, which is highly complex. This work at the end identifies several boxes that have some relation to breast cancer risk. And here's a more simple representation of what we found. We started using this as an index variant. That's the variant that the other group identified as used as index variant. And we found these 3 variants that are associated with a PI3K mutation in this locus, especially these 2. One of which is downstream from the MAP3K1 gene, but since the intergene region is very short, it might also be we could also consider the promoter region of the ZD9, and the other one is in the ZD9 gene. So the first question we ask is whether the variants are associated with this expression of the genes. And we always distinguish high risk and low risk allele. And you see that high risk and low risk does not modify PI3K expression, but it has an effect on MAP3K1 expression and ZD9 expression. It's even higher for ZD9. So high risk allele, this specific one, high risk allele correlates with a higher expression of ZD9 and the low risk allele with a lower expression. Similarly for MAP3 kinase 1, but much more so for ZD9. And we then did the full expression analysis for all 3 variants, and what we can show that MAP3K1 and ZD9 risk alleles are expressed at higher levels than low risk alleles, and the effect correlates with the distance of the SNV to the gene. So that's likely that still these variants must not necessarily be causal events, but they indicate in some way the region. So the closer we come to the gene, the closer we likely come to the causal variant. And MAP3K1 but not ZD9 is expressed at higher levels in PI3K mutated cancers. So the general effect on ZD9 does not reflect a situation if we consider only the PI3K mutated cancers. So what does it mean? Obviously, whether the tumor starts with a PI3K mutation or not does not depend on the genetic background. Mutations are completely random. So what we can say, what is likely to happen is that in the case of wild type PI3K, you can have MAP3K1, the low risk allele or the high risk allele. If you have the high risk allele, because you don't have a PI3K mutation, you may develop hyperplasia, but not a tumor. On the other hand, if the tumor starts with a PI3K mutation, and you have a low risk MAP3K1 allele, again, you won't develop cancer, or maybe only a hyperplasia. But if you have the combination of PI3K1 mutation with a high risk allele of MAP3 kinase 1, then you develop cancer. So that means there is an interaction between the two in developing cancer. Obviously, that's not to understand in an absolute manner. So the risk to develop cancer is higher, and here it's lower, and here it's very low. MAP3K1 alleles have no effect on the probability of PI3K mutation. That's a dogma, let's say. But PI3K mutated MAP3K1 overexpressing cells can form a cancer because we think that the high risk allele is associated with an overexpression of MAP3K1. The interesting thing is that MAP3K1 has already been identified as a cancer risk variant, breast cancer risk variant. So we asked whether what we see is simply limited to PI3K mutated cancer, or whether there's some other effect. And what we found is that one allele is associated with the risk of PI3K mutated cancer, and the other allele is associated with non-PI3K mutated breast cancer. And intriguingly, MAP3 kinase 1 has been described both as an oncogenic function and as tumor suppressor gene. So in our case, it could be, but that's, let's say, to the point at which we are, it's speculation. It could be overexpression in these cases in combination with PI3K determines an oncogenic effect of MAP3K1. And in the other cancers without PI3K mutation, it might be tumor suppressor activity, and lower expression correlates with the risk. But that has to be confirmed. What is interesting is that this interaction can be exploited for targeted chemoprevention. So I have a healthy person with a MAP3K1 higher risk allele, and I actually don't know whether she will develop a cancer with a PI3K mutation. But if she would, then she would be at higher risk. And so I could, because I know that aspirin influences the PI3K mutation associated risk, then I could start chemoprevention with anti-inflammatory drugs. And we know that PI3K induces COX-2, that induces pro-tumoral inflammation, and COX-2 is the target of aspirin. So that's a logical chain for targeted chemoprevention. You have a healthy person with a specific genetic risk for a specific molecular type of cancer, for which there is a specific chemoprevention. Okay, let's just say breast cancer risk associated variants are specifically associated with breast cancers carrying specific mutations. And here we have analyzed very few cases and only 21 variants. No, this must be done on hundreds of thousands of subjects that have been analyzed in genome-wide association studies for all the variants present in the genome. Because we suspect that this is a general phenomenon, because it's logic. You know, if the genetic variability influences actually everything, so why shouldn't it influence the probability of a specific mutation to develop into cancer? We think it's a general phenomenon. And the association yields insights into cancer biology, because we understand that the pathway, MAP kinase pathway and PI3K in some way interact. And maybe the key of interaction is COX-2, is inflammation. And as I said, knowing all that, we might be able to prevent specific cancers in a targeted way in high-risk subjects. So we have to validate it in a local cohort, and we have to functional validation in cell culture and xenografts. It's a little bit difficult because we still, as I told you, and that's always the case with genetic studies, that if you look at variants, what you find are associations. You say that if I have allele A, I have a higher risk than I have allele B. That's all. You cannot say allele A causes cancer and allele B protects from cancer. That's not possible, because you have the phenomenon of linkage. So variants that are close to each other are normally hereditated together, because they can be recombined only by crossing over. And crossing over is the more likely, the more two variants are distant. So you see an association for a variant, and that might only indicate that in this block, in this locus, there's something that determines high and low risk. And that's to say, if I would use CRISPR-Cas to introduce the two alleles in a cell line, it could be that nothing happens because the variant is not causative. It's just associated. No, I must first, before identify what is the real causing agent. No, and since it's likely expression of either MAP3 kinase 1 or ZD9, okay, I could overexpress these, but that's not still so good in. So I should identify the why there's different expression. So probably the variant that I have identified is in linkage with another variant in the promoter region, where it changes transcription factor binding. But these studies are extremely complex. If you look at the study that I have indicated from Glab and co-workers, it's really, it's a mess. It's really difficult to draw firm conclusions from that. And since even if you do it with CRISPR-Cas, changing single nucleotides is still a lot of work, you would like to be relatively sure about what you are going to do before you do it, no? Because you cannot change 1,000 variants, no? And okay, yes. And there is a question. Yes, okay, that's in part the response. So one part of the response is that we know that SNVs are associated with cancer, but they do not cause it. So that would not necessarily be a good target for cancer vaccination. On the other hand, variants are, for the patient who has, or the person who has a specific variant, that's normal. So it's recognized by the immune system as self, and it is tolerated. It would be difficult to vaccinate against it. And at the end, we should be really sure about it. It would be much more feasible to vaccinate against, let's say, PI3K mutations, for example. We know that, let's take the 5 most frequent mutations in breast cancer are present in 95% of breast cancers. We could vaccinate against these 5 mutations because, as I told you, oncogenic mutations normally are hotspot mutations, so we know where they occur, and we can vaccinate against it. So once a cancer starts with a PI3K mutation, then it is recognized by the immune system. And that's actually what people are trying to do. So with RNA vaccines, so the group that developed in Germany, that developed the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, before they worked on cancer, and I think they still do. Okay. And then the question, why do some people never eat tobacco or smoke, yet they get cancer? Okay, that's a famous question. No, that's normally, many people ask, if I say smoking causes cancer, then often people tell me, my grandfather smoked all his life and he died at 95 without cancer. And others tell, and my uncle, who never smoked, got lung cancer. So when we are speaking on risk, it's on probabilities. So when you smoke, you increase your probability simply because you induce mutations. The tobaccos, so the tar in the cigarettes and nicotine induce mutations in your lung epithelium. And these mutations, it's a simple probability game. They might hit an oncogene, they might also not hit an oncogene. Or even if they hit an oncogene, there might be some hyperplasia, but then your immune system kills it, because by chance, the immune system has recognized your tumor. So you only change your risk. It's not absolute, neither one way nor the other. No, the protection from cancer, nor the risk of cancer is absolute. Can we then identify genetic mutations in a family and develop vaccines so that the next generation wouldn't have to suffer from it? Yeah, that's a nice approach. I like that. Yeah, I think we could do that. I think we could do that. Because also, I mean, vaccination is not so a harsh intervention, even if it does not completely protect, it's no harm, no, normally. Obviously, you have to check before. How could a biomarker expressed for breast cancer be used for early detection? Yes, in order to, yes, biomarkers, we already talked about it yesterday. To use it for early detection is difficult, because really early detection would mean if the tumor is really, really small, and it likely will be hard to find markers that are, maybe with improving technology that might be possible. But in order to work, there's mainly a problem of specificity. But still, let's say, I said that 5 of the breast cancer mutations account for 95% of the tumors. We could analyze these mutations, because cancer cells die at any stage of their development, and they release their DNA into the blood flow. And if you would have sufficiently sensitive methods, we could find specific mutations in the blood flow, and then say there is something going on. The problem is, using mutations, we know that many healthy people have cancer mutations, because as I told you, it's not enough to have just one mutation. So, for example, there are people with a 922 translocation detectable in their blood, but they don't have leukemia. And there are many people who have BRAF mutations detectable in their blood, but they don't have melanoma, because it's not sufficient to have just one molecular hit. So you would need, in order to do a real early detection, because you wouldn't tell everybody you have cancer, That would not be ethical, no? And it would not be true. No? So you would need a combination of markers expressed or detectable in the blood, no? And that's not easy. But still, you could say if we would have the sensitivity of our methods, then we could detect combinations of mutations that are indicative of cancer. That might be possible one day. Or let's say mutations, we could also cancer metabolites, no? But I'm not an expert on that. Then we have the question, actually, I wish to work on the concept of developing vaccine against genetic mutations. Can we do the collaborative? Yes, I don't do vaccination. So that you should look for laboratories who are specialized in developing vaccination against genetic mutations. It's likely to become an important field because the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine development has shown that the RNA vaccines do work. No? And that's a major breakthrough. So now many people will go on to develop vaccines for mutated cancer proteins, no? But still consider it must be mutated, it must be presented. And there is still a whole, you could also study, I think that one future field that is really important, maybe you have seen that last year or 2019, no, 2020, I guess, there was a paper in Science from DeepMind from Google, a Google company that is called DeepMind. So that's an artificial intelligence company. And they have developed, based on artificial intelligence, an algorithm to predict the structure of proteins. Up to that publication, most people would have said that is not possible. But they have done it, and they can predict protein conformation from the primary sequence. And always I have learned at university, and maybe you have learned at university, that the structure of the protein not only depends on the primary sequence, it also depends on chaperones and on the way and the time of the synthesis of so that the amino terminal part is synthesized before the carboxy terminal part, no? And so everybody would have predicted that's not possible. But since the interaction with chaperones and the folding during synthesis also depends on the primary sequence, no? So DeepMind has shown that it is possible, and it is possible at a resolution similar to crystallography. So that's an enormous, advantage, an enormous step forward. I think another enormous step forward would be if somebody would do, based still on in artificial intelligence, neoantigen prediction. So take any sequence and predict whether it can be presented and whether there will be a T-cell receptor against it, because that's still not possible. We can predict with not so much accuracy whether a peptide can be presented or not, but still it's not very precise. So let's say 20% of hits. And still then we have to show that it can be recognized by a T-cell receptor. And that can be done only by experiments. So if somebody would do a prediction on that, no, that means many experiments to train an artificial intelligence system and then try whether the artificial intelligence system, try experimentally whether the predictions made by the artificial intelligence actually work, no? Is there any way we could predict the mutation by direct evolution method? So I'm not sure whether I understand that well. If you can detail your question a little bit more, but I try to respond. We can predict mutation because we know the frequencies with which mutations have been observed in many, many cancers. And the more we sequence cancers, the better we become in estimating the mutation. I don't know what you, so if you say, yeah, maybe you can reformulate your question that I understand better. So I said that what we can predict is association of mutations, no? Because we see that only cancers with specific combinations of mutations are cancers. So in the Big Bang, in the face of high genomic instability, when many mutations are generated, many combinations do not grow. So they kill the cell or they just don't grow. So that leads us to predict that PI3K mutation normally occurs in the presence of this or that other mutation. But still, I think we have to sequence more cancers to be more sure about that.
Any questions from other participants, please? No.
Okay.
Okay. So
I thank you all for participating, and I thank you much for your questions. Very interesting questions.
one more question is there.
Where is it? That on the, no, well, that's, I already answered.
Yes, sir. Sir, please give answer of this question, sir.
Yes, so cancer is a probabilistic event. If you can, let's say, smoking or tobacco, eating tobacco is not the only cause for lung cancer. You have other causes. You have replication errors. You can have other carcinogens in the air. No? Let's say you live close to a chemical industry, and the chemical industry doesn't respect all the rules for environment. Then you get chemical stuff in your lungs, and you might develop cancer for that reason. But you might also develop cancer simply for bad luck. No, because one cell in your body in a certain moment made a replication error, and you have a mutation, and that mutation grows into a hyperplasia, and then you have another hit of bad luck, and let's say you are in a bad period, you develop inflammation around the hyperplastic site, and then this develops into full-blown cancer. Can that reply to your question?
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Professor, this
Yes?
Dr. Subramanian, I have now small clarifications. So the epigenetic factors to what extent contribute towards cancers?
Yes. Epigenetic cancers can have, as I showed in the presentation, for example, by silencing tumor suppressor genes or by activating oncogenes, or for example, in my last example, PI3K MAP3 kinase 1 interaction, if it actually depends on the level of expression of MAP3 kinase 1, then epigenetic could have a large effect. No?
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Ulrich, this is Divya. I have a question.
Yes?
Sir, previously there were the percentage of the cancers that the people were suffering were very much less in comparison to what we are doing the research today. So the statistics have been improved a lot. So what could be the reason for this? I mean, I understand there are a lot of reasons like exposure to the carcinogens. What could be the more apt reason for improving the statistics to this extent and making us work on doing this research to this extent? Rather, we could stop that basic reason which is causing the cancer, so that it would be of great help than this research, right, sir? Am I right? Did you get me?
Yes, I think that in cancer statistics, they have improved over time, and it's very difficult to compare data from many years ago to the recent. The cancer incidence, which appears to be much growing, is much influenced by the detection of cancer. So that means in later times, people died in some way and nobody knew it was cancer.
Probably.
Now, normally cancer is diagnosed. That's one reason. Another reason is that we do much screening for cancer. And many, let's say, mammography detects many early stage cancers. And not all early stage cancers would have developed into full-blown cancer. So, for example, you get many ductal carcinoma in situ. And those without mammography, nobody would have seen them, and most of them would never have formed a cancer. So the cancer incidence, that's, for example, extremely by melanoma, where you can say that due to our awareness of sun exposure-related cancers, we do much more melanoma screening and we detect much more melanomas, but not all would have developed into a life-threatening disease, no? There was an article last year in New England Journal of Medicine where just for melanoma, this was compared. And they also said it might depend on who does the screening, because in the United States, the doctor who does the screening often is also the doctor who does the treatment. So the surgery for a small melanoma. So he has an economical interest in detecting melanomas, no? So that all contributes, no? That are all factors that have to be considered, no? And
I'm working on the same melanoma cell line, sir. I'm working on the culprit BRAF, which is causing the melanoma. I'm into it. Fine, sir. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Is there any other questions?
Hi, Prof.
Yeah.
Hi, Prof. Yes. As you mentioned just now, due to diagnosis, we're able to detect and the incidence is getting higher. But how about the childhood or pediatric cancer, as the incidence also raising high?
Is it? I'm not a specialist in pediatric cancer, and I didn't think that it is rising. I know it's rising. Melanoma is rising in pediatric cancer, in pediatric patients, but still this might be overdiagnosis. But for example, I can say that only for melanoma and for European countries. When I was a young boy, I didn't travel to anywhere. So I just stayed in Germany, and when the sun started, when it was not raining, I was outside, and when the sun started, I get tanned. No, so I had a slow development of tanning, and I never used sun creams or something like that, because I slowly get tanned, and I never had problems with the sun. Today, Germans, they go on Christmas, they take an airplane and go to the Maldives, no, to get 1 week full power sun, no, and they do that with their kids, no, and that's extremely harmful for kids, no. I think there could be a relation, no, and then the use of but on kids, I think at least in Europe, sunscreens are prohibited for kids now. But maybe elsewhere they even use to tan their kids. I don't know in the States, no. But in Europe it's prohibited. You cannot send your kid in a tanning study, no.
So basically, yes, sir, sorry, sir. So basically, from what you have mentioned, it's more of a lifestyle compared to genetics.
No, I don't want to judge its more lifestyle. So let's say it's very difficult because we know the real highly incident environmental causes of cancer still are tobacco smoke and UV radiation, no? And it's not, I don't think it's a bias in the type of studies. So the chemical carcinogens that are found in the environment have not so a clear contribution. And that might, in my eyes, depend on the fact that most chemical pollution is very local. So you might have strong local effects. So if you look, we have, for example, air pollution. Now, air pollution definitely contributes to lung cancer. But if you look at the whole population, then you don't see the effect. But if you look at 1/4 of your city, which is highly polluted, then you can see the effect. And that should be done much more to look at specific conditions. There is, let's say, people living close to industrial plants, chemical industry, or people exposed to poisoned water for the drinking water. There you might find clear environmental carcinogenesis, no? But if you do that on the whole population, you wouldn't see. What you can see, let's say, and on the contrary, I'm convinced in my personal life history, I can say that when I was a kid in the 60s and 70s, there was much less awareness about pollution. So I was exposed to many carcinogens. No, I know that the fences in Germany, Germans like fences, and they protected the wood with some diluent, and it was later shown to be carcinogenic, and it was one of the more normal smells in my childhood, no, because nobody cared, nobody knew, no. Now we know many substances that have a carcinogenic effect, and we are much more aware, and we control much more, so that it could even be that the worst of chemical carcinogens is already over, no? But with an exception, it might be different for specific substances in specific places, no? And okay, we have still the problem with glyphosate that is still used in I don't know, in India, in Europe, and in the United States. It's still used. It should be prohibited in the next years, and there is a demonstrated effect, carcinogenic effect, no, that eventually could translate into a higher cancer incidence.
Thank you, sir.
How could MHRD mimic technology is a new approach in breast cancer therapy, and how the outcome will be? MHRD mimics, so to produce mRNAs or mRNA, so microRNAs that are not natural microRNAs but are designed to have specific effects on specific genes. Well, I think it's an approach that must be tested. The problem with mRNAs is always that they have normal dozens of targets, and it's hard to predict what the actual outcome will be, especially in vivo. So if you do it in vitro on a single cell, you can test and test, and at the end you come up, you silence several genes, but the net effect is an effect that you wish to obtain. I think that will likely come to the development of some drugs that might act in some cancers or in some cancer subtypes. Yes. It's just like other drugs, and it has the advantage that you can deliver easily and over long times. It's and it can, even if it in no single time it will get into any cell, but it could potentially, if you can deliver it many times, you could obtain an effect on many cells. The cell-specific delivery will be difficult. Comment on the efficiency of nanotech-based drug delivery and research avenues in clinical setting. Yeah, okay, that's linked to the, I think that I have a colleague here at the Children's Hospital with whom I have collaborated, who is developing liposomes, and there are other nanotech devices that can be used to do drug delivery. I think it's promising. It's promising, but it's still not ready for the clinics, I would say. So then the main aim would be to have a specific delivery, to the tumor cells, based on tumor surface molecules that are recognized by antibodies and that can direct a nano device to the cell in order to release the drug. Yeah, that's promising. Oh, magnetic hyperthermia and its usefulness. I don't know. Let's say hyperthermia surely will do something. So because it's again, like many other drug approaches or therapy approaches that rely on the higher higher vulnerability of cancer cells, and so you could think of treatments that hyperthermia that is tolerated by normal cells, but that yields in the tumor generalized cancer cell killing. I don't know whether it also can change or truly can change the microenvironment. I would guess, but probably somebody has studied that, but I'm not an expert in that. Thank you.
So is there any other questions from the participants? Okay.
Yes, epigenetics plays a role in cancer. As I told you, it can, on the one hand, it determines cancer development by silencing tumor suppressor genes or inducing oncogenes, and in any way regulating gene expression. And it can also play a role in therapy, for example, immunotherapy, where epigenetics can contribute to the silencing of T cells, so extortion of T cells or non-expression of antigens and so on. So it definitely has a role in cancer. Is using tools for data analysis better than using programs and codes? Well, where's the difference? I mean, a tool is a code. Isn't the tool always so if the question is whether it's better to use commercial tools, I would say no, because different from many other things in the world, what is non-commercial in bioinformatics most often is better, simply because many people develop tools in bioinformatics. And it's a rule in the field that bioinformatic codes and programs are made available to everybody. So you immediately have the last generation of tools, whereas the commercial ones collect tools and change them. The difference often is that the commercial ones have a much better user interface, so it's easier to use for a non-specialist, a non-bioinformatician, and they have often a better presentation, graphical presentation of the results. No? So it depends a little bit on who you are. If you are a biologist without deep, if you cannot write code, then you cannot write code. No? I mean, can we rely completely on the tools and neglecting the null values? I'm not sure that I understand that question. Can you detail your question a little more? So if you're missing data, you intend null values as missing data?
Karthika, please explain.
Yes, missing data. Okay. Yes, it depends on the amount of missing data. If you have just some sample and some data point is missing, that normally is not a problem. If it becomes more, then you have to check for that. And anyway, you shouldn't neglect. You should keep in mind, and you should show in the final presentation that there are data missing. So that's important. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your questions and for your patience with me. And we'll meet again on Wednesday.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for your extraordinary lectures and nice interactions. And thank you, participants, for your purposeful questions, which is making everyone to learn many things from Professor. And I'm also a learner along with you also. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. And we will the last day.
Thank all of you and see you next week.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.